All right, I think we're all set and ready to go. Hopefully a few more people will trickle in the next couple minutes, but we have a nice group here. If you can hear me, if things seem like they're working from your end, then just give me a thumbs up or say we can hear you in the comments. The comments, when I get them, just for, I think it's the latency, takes me about 3 or 5 seconds to see them. It's echoing. Ooh. Is everyone getting that echoing? Yes, shoot. Okay, let me see if I can. I don't know if that's helping at all. Is that any better? No echoing there. Okay, all right, good. So yeah, so this is strange times. Yeah, and the silver lining, I think, for me at least, is that everyone's expectations for production value has gone down quite a bit. There's all these late night hosts and whatnot broadcasting from home, and things are not quite as slick, which I figured was my entree into this because my mic isn't working, and I'm at home. My computer's acting up right now, and yeah, and there's a good chance, there's about a 50-50 chance that at some point in the middle of this, my kids will run through the background throwing a tantrum. My dog may bark, phones may ring. So yeah, we're all doing the best we can, and glad you guys can hear. Glad things are working for you. One last thing. So if you go here to stormwritingschool.com/p/livestream, there's a link there for the handouts, and the handouts you don't need right away. It's just basically a PDF of the presentation I'm going to give you, so you could follow along with that if you'd like. Oh, good. Thanks, Heidi. Turned off the YouTube speakers thing, and it's all well. Good. So there's that handout, and then there's also another handout that'll kind of that has 2 excerpts, longer excerpts. I'm including a lot of excerpts here, and trying to have a nice variety of genres and POVs, etc. But we'll get started with this and jump right in. So, like I said, strange times. We're really trying to deal with these challenges here, and I think art is as important as it ever has been, if not more important. You know, I was just thinking about, my wife works in a hospital, and she's not a nurse. She's not exposed to a lot of this. She's actually non-essential clinical activities, so she's been sent home for now, but will probably be called in at some point. And so we're kind of bracing for that coming down the line. And there are people out there, you know, doing very important work with healthcare and researching things, and all sorts, and disseminating knowledge, and getting out the important knowledge, and working on vaccines, etc. But I think art is as necessary now as it ever has been. It gives us meaning, helps us keep perspective on things, and people are turning to art quite a bit right now. And I also think that art is just really important for your well-being, for your own. Yeah, sorry, Heidi, I don't have separate speakers going right now, so there shouldn't be any echo from my end of things. But art, I think, is really necessary for your well-being, and having that creative outlet is good for mental health. So hence this. I think this is the role that we can play in this. So we're looking at how to give insight into character via your narrator. And as we go, I'm able to get rid of my image here and let you see the just the presentation itself. But this term insight, I was really interested in, because if you break it down into insight, it's looking into the character. And stories move not just by the external events of what happens, but by how the characters within them are processing those external events and perceiving them, what their state of mind is. Lisa Cron, who wrote Story Genius, talks about the third rail. She says if the story is the train or the subway, The third rail is the character's history, attitudes, desires, needs, motivations, those sorts of things that are sort of electrifying the movement of the story. And so though we're watching the external movement of the story, we're really feeling and we're electrified and powered by this third rail. And so I want to see what can we do in our narration to look into that, to try to get to that power, really. This is also, if you've taken a class with me before, you know that I'm often a little overambitious with what I can fit into whatever our time allotment is. And I've already pared this back quite a bit from what I had, which was about a 3-hour session. So this is really just sort of an overview, and it's going to give you, what I want to deliver is kind of a taxonomy of some different things you can do with your narration to deliver that insight into characters. All right. I want to start with this little story, and hopefully this is visible enough to you, but The Orphan Lamb by Amy Hempel, and I'll read it. He carved the coat off the dead winter lamb, wiped her blood on his pants to keep a grip, circling first the hooves and cutting straight up each leg, then punching the skin loose from muscle and bone. He tied the skin with twine over the body of the orphan lamb so the grieving ewe would know the scent and let the orphan lamb nurse. Or so he said. This was seduction. This was the story he told, of all the farm boy stories he might have told. He chose the one where brutality saves a life. He wanted me to feel, when he fitted his body over mine, that this was how I would go on. This was how I would be known. So, powerful little story here. And yes, I can get rid of that banner on the bottom. There you go. Thanks. Powerful little story here. And anytime I get writers in a room, of course, and I give them an excerpt that's this good, they want to spend a half hour talking about it, which is a good instinct. But I'm really just bringing this up for a simple illustration, which is to show how this story turns and changes once it's clear to us that the narrative stance is other than what we thought it was in the first 2 paragraphs. There's a pretty poignant story in the first 2 paragraphs, and that third one delivers this shift, and it turns out that this is a first-person narrator, and the impact of this story, I think, really comes from that final paragraph about what this story he told meant to this character. So this is just a quick illustration among many things we could illustrate. I could talk about this story for an hour, but among many things we could illustrate with this story, a quick illustration of how narrative stance is important. Narrative stance, when I use that term, is how you, the writer, situate the narrator in relation to the character or characters. And there are 2 dimensions to narrational stance, breadth and depth. And so I want to go into those a little bit just by way of orientation, and then I'll give you kind of a taxonomy of some different strategies you can take with your narration. Breadth is just about how many characters' internal workings the narrator can describe. And I mention this because it's really going to vary. Your story, the story you're telling, and your approach and your POV is going to have a big effect on the next dimension, which is depth. But this is many heads to singular all along the spectrum. And this is omniscient, obviously, and then we're all the way down to very close third or first person narration. And there's some gradations along the way, which are going to be very tempting for me to delve into. And in the interest of time, I won't this time around. But I'll sort of touch on them, and apologies right now for bringing up some topics that you'll want to know more about. All right, depth is how deep the narrator can delve into the character or character's interiority. And this is what we have. We have the character at the most shallow end of things, or the shallow surface, is the external stuff. And this is on the outside entirely, as if you're an observer looking on. And the narrator is not at all attuned to what's going on the inside of the character. And maybe I'll just get rid of my face here. Quick. There we go. Okay, perception is when we have, when it's clear to us that we are aligned with a character's perception of events. That is still relatively shallower than feeling or thought, which are deeper still. Feeling gets us aligned with their emotional responses. And then thought, I would say, is the most intimate. When we are looking at other people in real life, you can obviously have access to the external stuff. You can see what's happening around them. You can see what they're doing. You can take some good guesses at what they're perceiving. If you see them sniff the air and then make a face, you may know that they're smelling something that's unpleasant. You may know from their facial expression even that they're feeling disgust. But thoughts, we don't know. That's the black box for us. So completely out of our range, right? Some examples of this. External would be just to say, Chloe looked at Ben. That's something we could observe as an impartial outside observer. We can see, oh, okay, Chloe's looking at that guy. And if we knew their names, if they were like, you know, coworkers of ours, we could see that, narrate that. Perception is when we go to something like, Chloe noticed Ben move across the room with a slight limp. The noticing is Chloe perceiving it. And again, we can maybe guess that, but the narrator makes it clear that, that the narrator is then aligned with Chloe in that perceiving. If we can add to that sentence, and worried he might fall, now we have some sense of Chloe's feeling. And then we can do something like this. She wanted to be there to help him, but could she face him again after what she'd said? So that gets to thought. All right. So I just orient you to all of this by way of saying that, again, if you're writing an omniscient and you're sort of at this end of the extreme, you're likely not going to be going quite as deep into character, whereas if you're at this end of the extreme, very close, then you may be very much in this realm and actually not a lot of pure external, which I'll get to in a bit. And here's where it's very tempting. And you can see the headings up here with these tempting titles. But this would be a book like Charles Dickens. I was just looking through some of these. Charles Dickens, Our Mutual Friend. And that's, Dickens has a lot. His default approach is omniscient. And it's pretty external. It gives us some idea of perception. But I would say the epicenter of what he's doing is up here. Light omniscient would be something, and light omniscient and more omniscient, don't go Googling those because I have no idea what you'll find. These are terms that I've just come up with, and especially more omniscient. As far as I know, no one else uses that. So kind of weird for individual to me, idiosyncratic. But light omniscient is something like Harry Potter. Harry Potter gives the impression that it was all from his perspective, but it's in fact omniscient narration. It's just that it's pretty light. It doesn't go into a lot of other heads. But she does have that access. And if you remember, if you read the book, the first one, Harry is not in the first chapter really at all. I mean, he's a baby. So he's not doing any of the thinking or perceiving. It's Dumbledore and McGonagall and Hagrid. And so it's totally outside of his perspective. And she does that every once in a while in other parts of the book. More omniscient is a can of worms, but this basically means you are limited technically to a first person or third person narrator, but there are little tricks you have going on that give us the sense that you have access to other heads. And so the clearest example of this is first person retrospective. When the narrator is older looking back on the character, that narrator can say things that typically we would only see in omniscient narration. Things like, you know, what I didn't know then is that across town, Melissa was baking a cake or something like that. It's the sort of thing that, well, how could a limited narrator know that? And yet this more omniscient POV or perspective situates that narrator as actually knowing more than the character does and having that access, even though they still are pretty much limited to that character's perspective. So that's one example of that, and there's some of this for third person too, but won't delve into that now. Limited is big range, and that's first person or third person, where we're limited to one perspective at a time, I should say. So in any given chapter or scene, we're only in one head, and we're limited entirely to that head. It's pretty versatile. It's probably the dominant mode of storytelling these days because it has a pretty wide range here. And then ventriloquism is the term I use for very, very close, consistently close, I should say, narration that's limited to a single perspective. And George Saunders is kind of the king of this, where everything in the narration is imbued with the character's feeling and perception of things. So, so if you're writing over here like him, you're going to have a little bit less. You're going to have to kind of do some tweaks with how you're getting at the external. It's all going to be kind of filtered through that character. If you're writing omniscient, you're not going to go as deep, and that's fine. That's kind of where you should be. So just to let you know that there's going to be some variety based on how you're narrating things. Okay, here's our taxonomy, and here's really what we're here for. External narration, this is the list, and then I'm going to delve into them a little bit deeper, but I just want to orient you to the list here. External narration, external tinge with subjectivity, emotion stated, indirect thoughts, and direct thoughts. External narration, there's no perceiver necessarily within the scene. It's what you might notice as an observer, and it's the camera's view. It's basically taking the vantage point of the camera as the narrator. So it includes things like dialogue, actions, gestures, body language, description of setting. But this is what's important about it, is it's impartial. So it's not tinged with any judgment or perception on the part of any character. It's completely outside of that. Images are blurry. Are other people getting clear images? It might be the buffering on someone's end there, Roy. Other people chime in and let me know if that's seems to be coming from my end or from Roy. Oh yeah, breadth and depth can definitely be mixed within a story. In fact, they pretty much always are. And that's why I have this graph up here, which is basically a graph where it's just kind of inverted because I liked having this as a shallower level than the deep thoughts. All right, so it's impartial, and that's what's key. Here's an example. Coat came to the top of the stairs. This is from Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. Coat came to the top of the stairs and opened the door. His room was austere, almost monkish. There was a black stone fireplace in the center of the room, a pair of chairs, and a small desk. The only other furniture was a narrow bed with a large, dark chest at its foot. Nothing decorated the walls or covered the wooden floor. So this is external. It's really not even from Coat's perspective. His name is Quoth in the book. His name kind of over the course of the narrative. So you can see that this is totally external, totally outside of him. And it does actually convey something about his character or his personality, but it doesn't tell us anything about his state of mind within the scene. And that's what I really want to get at, is what can you do with your narration to convey that state of mind? The difference here is character is semi-permanent. It's personality, basically. So we know from this that Quote is austere, for instance, pretty minimal, right? That's his approach to things. But state of mind is in flux, scene to scene. State of mind is more dynamic, and it's really more what we're reading for, which is not to say that we shouldn't characterize or give some sense of personality. Also, I say semi-permanent because you would hope that over the course of a story, the character may change and evolve and transform a little bit. So it's not permanent, it's semi-permanent. It's going to evolve over the course of the whole narrative. But state of mind is the stuff that we can control on a scene level, scene by scene. So the first excerpt I gave you doesn't really do that. This one is from Normal People by Sally Rooney. And there's a little cheat in this, but it's otherwise external. Lorraine folds the rubber gloves up neatly and places them below their sink. Then she starts unclipping her hair. To Connell, this seems like something she could accomplish in the car. And I hear you did very well, she says. He was top of the class, says Marianne. Right, Connell says. Marianne did pretty good too. Can we go? Normal people, by the way, doesn't use quote marks, so that's you get used to it, but so that's how this is, and sometimes the narration and the dialogue seems to blend together, but you really do get used to it. All right, here's the cheat, right? To Connell, this seems like something she could accomplish in the car. Shows us that's his perspective. If we were to get rid of that, though, we still have an external narration here, external storytelling, that is giving us a sense of Connell's state of mind, largely because of the dialogue at the end here. Can we go? Right, Connell says. Marianne did pretty good too. Can we go? We know from that he is feeling a little bit awkward here, that he's impatient and antsy and maybe a little nervous, right? Which is not to say that we should get rid of this blue line. It's just an illustration of the external narration accomplishing what the example above from Coates did not. Which is, it gives us a sense of the state of mind. An exercise that I might recommend, I actually strongly recommend this one, it's not going to be the assignment that I'm giving you for the next day, is to try writing a scene that is purely external narration. It's really good practice in dramatizing and implying states of mind, but there are a few pitfalls to look out for. And when people do this, they go into external narration thinking that the old show don't tell thing is what we should be following in all writing, and the best way to do that is to be totally external. However, when I see people try this, there are two things that they do that work against them. And one is to micromanage the external action. And that is just to hyper detail, to go in there and say, okay, I'm doing external, I'm going to show stuff, so I'm basically going to describe the video that's playing in my head. So you do things like, he reached for the doorknob with his right hand, then turned it clockwise. This is unnecessary to go to this level of detail, probably. I mean, it's all sort of context dependent, but most likely to say he opened the door is going to do the trick. The other thing is people end up resorting to stock actions because they think show don't tell. And so they try to illustrate emotions through things like this. A sweat broke out on his brow as he white-knuckled the doorknob and breathed unsteadily. So we have these stock kind of cliche actions that are pretty generic. A sweat broke out on his brow. There's so many brows, so many people writing about brows. And I don't think about brows at any other time in my life. White knuckling is another thing that I don't really, I've tried actually to white knuckle and my knuckles don't turn white. But, and breathing unsteadily and, all of these things, heart throbbing. And if you're feeling called out, yeah, I do this too. We all do this. And I wouldn't worry about this. Don't let this stop a rough drafts, by the way. Just go ahead and throw them in there. And then later go through and kind of get them out of there. And some can stay. It's not that all of this is bad. There are also, I talk sometimes about like the deadly sin verbs, look, smile, nod, shrug, turn. These are all ones that people use a lot, especially in dialogue situations. And it's not that you have to get rid of all of them. People do look and they do turn and they do shrug. It's totally fine to have those. It's just that we tend to overuse those things. And we rely then on these generic things. So how can you make this interesting and powerful when you're describing external stuff? The key here is really to be specific, unique, and idiosyncratic, to think of what are some gestures and language, body language, and that sort of thing. What can people do that is a little bit more individual to them rather than generic? So if someone is nervous, rather than have them like biting their fingernails, which is kind of like the universal gesture for showing nervousness, what can you do instead? I'm using a few excerpts from Normal People by Sally Rooney, and what she does in here, is a couple times at least, is Connell's a very shy, nervous, I think he has some social anxiety, and later we learn of some other issues he has going on with some anxiety, which I won't spoil right now. But she has him at one point he puts his hands in his pockets so deep it's as if he's trying to fold his entire body inside. That's something that's specific and idiosyncratic. That's showing us some nervousness and kind of awkwardness that is better than biting fingernails. You can think too about objects and setting. What is it around the person? Where are they? And what objects or props do they have at their disposal that can give you a more idiosyncratic reaction? So if someone is in an airport waiting to go on a plane, rather than have them pace and bite their fingernails and check their watch and all those sorts of things that would be sort of typical, what can they do? What objects are available to them? What's the setting? You know, maybe a boarding pass. Maybe someone gets out a boarding pass on the way they're kind of like shuffling against their knuckles or something like that to show it. You would think, by the way, that boarding passes would be out of style these days because everyone has smartphone apps for this. But for some reason, the last 5 flights I've been on, I've always ended up with a paper boarding pass. I don't know why, but so it's still pretty authentic. Situation also matters, and so I tell this to writers all the time: think in your scene of the conflict and the desire. Those are really the things we're latched onto, and that's going to give you a context in which to make external action interesting and powerful. And this kind of harkens back to the Amy Hempel story at the beginning. The situation of the seduction, right, suddenly makes this story that he's telling about the orphan lamb really intriguing, really interesting. So, situation, specific, unique, idiosyncratic objects and setting, all of those are going to help out. An example of this that also is going to transition us into the next thing, and this is from Wanderers by Chuck Wendig, which I've just started. It's one of these novels that you should maybe not be reading these days. I don't know, I'm torn on the pandemic lit thing. Some people find it therapeutic actually to read some of these things, but other people find it scary. I think my initial, this is an aside, my initial reaction was to avoid that sort of stuff, but then I saw some, I don't even remember what it was. I heard some story that was fictional account of a pandemic, and it made me feel better for some reason. I think just maybe employing my imagination. Total aside. This one, external narration. They found Nessie 4 hours later at the wooden bus shelter on Granger, hiding from a sudden rain squall, shivering like a stray puppy. When Dad picked her up, she kicked and thrashed, and it was like watching a wrestler try to pin a tornado. But then he gave up, said to her, "You want to run away? You run away. But if you're thinking of going after your mother, I don't think she wants to be found." It was like watching a glass of water tip in slow motion. Nessie collapsed in his arms and wept so hard she could only catch her breath in these keening, air-sucking hinges. Her shoulders shook and both hands on her armpit herself. They got her home. All right. Yeah, and if we have some people buffering, then just ask in the comments. And if other people it seems good to you, then let me know. If I'm hearing a bunch of people say like you're buffering and stuttering on this, then I'll try to troubleshoot. So this is external narration mostly, but skipping ahead, but not entirely, right? You guys are, I'm likely picking up on a few things that are not impartial here, and that's going to get us into this next part. They found, it situates us with a perspective character shivering like a stray puppy. Really, to me, seems like it's the assessment of the perspective character, who happens to be Nessie's sister, actually. When Dad picked her up, not when Nessie's father, right? That would be outside and external, but here we have when Dad, so that name. And so there's just a few hints that this is, thanks for chiming in, guys. A few hints that this is not entirely the impartial external narration I was talking about. And here's the thing, I'm really fond of this quote from Victor Shklovsky. The purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived, not as they are known. This really gets back to the third rail thing I was talking about, that we want to know what events of a story mean to a character. And that's what's going to move us. And that's really why we're hooked to the story. This is abundantly clear when you look at historical fiction, or fiction, not even historical fiction, but fiction reimaginings of real life events, right? So like Apollo 13, and we can look at the facts and know what happened with Apollo 13, but the art of making the film that narrativizes that story and gives us that story is to give us the sensation of things as they were perceived by those astronauts. So I'm super fond of this quote, and that's the thing, is we get back to this and it's giving us a sense of how things were perceived by the POV character here as she's watching her sister and her reaction to her mother running away, basically, or going out of the house and not coming back. So this gets us to the next step. Oh, actually, quick brief aside, which is I looked in all sorts of books for extended excerpts on external narration, and it was actually hard to find, especially things that were giving insight into character state of mind. There were all sorts of scene setting things, kind of like that one I got from Name of the Wind. But beyond that, to have a story that's entirely external narration, like that exercise I was asking you to do before, which I still encourage, but with the knowledge that you probably don't want to write a story like that. Ernest Hemingway, you can look up Ernest Hemingway's story, The Killers. And The Killers is pretty much entirely external. I don't think a story like that would sell nowadays. Ernest Hemingway wrote that in 1927, late 20s, I'm guessing, which is right around the time that like film with sound came out. It precedes video, it precedes TV. Nowadays, we can't compete with video and film when it comes to that. It's purely external stuff. And the strength of writing and the strength of prose storytelling is exactly this, that it's giving us a very strong sense of how it's perceived, how the story is perceived. So that interiority is where we shine. And so I would lean into that. The external narration stuff was very hard to find. And when I found it, it wasn't actually all that gripping or resonant for me. You can look and make your own judgments. So the next thing is external tinged with subjectivity. And this is when the external action and the description is clearly filtered via the perception of a character. And we saw that with the excerpt from Chuck Wendig, and I'll just give you that first paragraph of it again. They found Nessie 4 hours later at the wooden bus shelter on Granger, hiding from a sudden rain squall, shivering like a stray puppy. When Dad picked her up, she kicked and thrashed. So we already read it, but here are some things you can do to bring a little subjectivity into the external action. Similes and metaphors we just saw, as well as names and titles. Shivering like a stray puppy, it was like watching a wrestler. Those are subjective comparisons on the part of the POV character. And then I already pointed this one out, the names and titles. When Dad, right? If you say something like, when Craig spoke with the police officer, then we're allied with Craig more so than the police officer. Or it's the perspective of somebody who knows Craig, and the police officer is more anonymous. And it's not just two random guys talking. So similes, metaphors is going to help clue the reader in to the fact that there is some subjectivity behind the external action. Names, titles, diction, filtering sensual selectivity. Here's an example of diction. This is from, I didn't put the story title here. This is Anything Helps by Jess Walter, a story I love and I've used in several of my classes. But Bit walks on. Bit is panhandling. He is homeless and he's out there trying to earn some money, and so he's just made a sign that says anything helps. Bit walks on west toward his other spot. There are a few others out, stupid crankers, faces stupid, signs stupid, some 40-year-old baker with Vietnam vet, too dumb to know he wasn't born yet, and a coke ghost with tiny writing. Can you help me feed my children, please? They're at stupid intersections too, with synced lights, so the cars never stop. So this is clearly tinged with the subjectivity of bit, even though it's describing external stuff. We have all of these words that are giving his subjective view of the thing. So diction is your word choice, and that's going to help clue us in to the state of mind of the character as they're moving toward that external action. Filtering just means when you give us a verb of perception to accompany narration that is otherwise external action. So it just situates a character in relation to that action. We saw this in my first example when I had Chloe looked at Ben or something, and then the next line was Chloe noticed Ben walk across the room with a slight limp. You could easily say Ben walked across the room with a slight limp, but you bring in the filtering and that situates Chloe in relation to the action of Ben, and then it's probably going to set up your subjective descriptions following that, and probably going to set up deeper layers of narration. So that's why it sort of transitioned naturally into the next examples I gave about how she was worried he might fall, and that she wanted to go talk to him, etc. So that's what I would do, is sometimes filtering. A lot of times you hear filtering is bad, avoid it, but it can, it has a role. When he reaches the garden doors, he sees Jamie. This is from Normal People. He sees Jamie and Marianne are standing at the counter having some kind of argument. They don't see Connell through the glass right away. He pauses with his hand on the door handle. Marianne is all flushed, maybe from too much sun, or maybe she's angry. Jamie is unsteadily refilling his champagne glass with red wine. Connell turns the handle and comes inside. All right, he says. They both look at him. They both stop talking. He notices Marianne is shivering as if she's cold. Jamie lifts his glass sarcastically in Connell's direction, sloshing wine over the rim and onto the floor. All right, we've got Connell as the perspective character. This is a pretty external scene. And in Normal People is a very, it's a very close novel. It vacillates between Marianne's perspective and Connell's, but there's a lot of interiority in it. And yet in this scene, it's fairly external and fairly backed off from that. But he sees and he notices are the filtering. We've got as if she's cold as a simile or metaphor. And then we have this sort of his guessing at what's happening. Maybe from too much sun, or maybe she's angry. And we can guess that it's him surmising that, right? All right, next is sensual selectivity. This is a term from Robert Olin Butler in his book, From Where You Dream. And he talks about sensual selectivity is just when details are narrated. The details narrated are ones the character would be paying attention to. If you walk into a room and you are feeling frightened, nervous, spooked, the things you're going to notice are different than if you walk into that room and you are in love, for instance, right? So that's all this means, is that it appears to be pretty external, but again, there's just that sense of these details are ones this character is paying attention to. This is from a middle grade novel. Oh, I don't have it here. It's from a middle grade novel by this author, Megan Morrison. And my daughter loves these, and we've been reading these. And this one's from Disenchanted, which is basically a retelling of Cinderella. And this version of Cinderella used to work in a sweatshop. Now she's older and much wealthier, but she's still very concerned about labor laws, basically. And so she goes into this sweatshop in the bad part of town. And here's what she notices as she goes in. It was a long rectangular slab of a room with a few narrow windows so dirty that no sunlight broke through. Half of the chamber was packed close with people of all ages, kneeling on threadbare mats and spinning at their wheels, many of them smothering coughs as they worked. Her mother also died of this thing called the roup or something, which was this sickness that a lot of these sweatshop workers got. So she is paying attention to the dirty windows, the people coughing, the threadbare mats. It's a little different from Diction because it's not necessarily the words she would have to use in these cases. It's just the details she's noticing because that's her state of mind. if it was the sweatshop manager and he's walking into that room, he's not going to pay attention to those things, right? He's paying attention to who's working and who's not, who seems to be slacking off, and she's not. She's paying attention to the conditions here. So that's what that means. You see a lot of this in romance when people are in love, and the narration is just purely of someone's external appearance. It's of their external appearance, and you don't even need to say, you know, that someone's muscles made you swoon or something like that. All it is just paying sort of close attention to movement and parts of the body and gestures and that sort of thing. And it just gives you a sense that the POV here is enamored with that person. Okay, I'll pause really quick just to say, are there any big pressing questions right now? And again, just a preview that on Thursday, what I'm going to do at the end of this is give you an assignment for you to work on over the course of the next day. And then on Thursday, I'll have a QA, totally optional for anyone to show up. I have no idea how many people will be there. I'm trying a Zoom conference so I can see you and we can actually talk and have a dialogue rather than this, which is pure lecture. And so try that Zoom conference. And if there's other big questions that come up, then I'll try to address those also. Emotion stated. So emotion can be implied, and we've seen that in the external stuff, how sometimes the emotion is implied, and it does just fine with that implication. But you can state it outright. You can talk about emotion with labels, basically, of those, the labels of those abstract or emotions, the adjectives and nouns describing them. Is there a screen recording of this we can review? I'm technically stealing work time right now. Thanks, Dan. Yes, this should be recorded and it should stay on YouTube after this. And I don't know, this is my first time, but so I'm pretty sure that's how that works. And I don't know if there's just a buffering sort of window of time that'll be available in an hour or two, but yes, it'll be recorded. And say more about diction. Diction is just the word choice of the narration. And when that diction is the word choice that the POV character would use, that's going to clue us in to their state of mind. And you can, you know, so that has Bit walking to the corner and seeing these stupid crankers. I don't know what that is, probably some sort of specific drug addict, and a baker with a sign that says Vietnam vet. And I'm assuming a baker is a pot smoker, but I don't actually know that either. And so he's using those terms, and those are terms that Bit knows in that situation. And so the diction of the external narration, the scene is otherwise externally narrated, but some of the words are showing us that that is the character's attitude because of, oh, thanks, Anne. The crank, yeah, crystal meth. That's the character's attitude toward what he's seeing or she's seeing. Okay, emotion. The type of scene matters a lot when you're stating emotions. So you'll likely do it less in those scenes of urgent external action. And by the way, you tend to get a little bit more external with a little less labeling of emotion and even thought when the scene is very external and urgent. When there's a bit of adrenaline to what's happening, you can back off from some of the internal stuff that I'm about to get into here. So that's when it's a little bit more appropriate. And so in Normal People, I was showing you that one where Connell comes upon Marianne and Jamie having the argument, and there's some adrenaline there, and then the next thing that happens is I think we'll see this in a bit, but the next thing that happens is Jamie and Marianne are talking, and Jamie purposely drops a glass of champagne or wine on the floor, and it breaks, and she kind of attacks him. This is, again, a scene in a novel that is otherwise very interior, but because there's a bit of adrenaline going on, we can back off from some of that because we're feeling it. Deborah Gwartney, who's a memoirist, writes creative nonfiction essays, has given this advice, which I've always found very useful. When the situation is hot, write cold, which is to say, back off a little bit from the interiority and the internal state of mind stuff, because the situation itself is getting the reader to feel what the characters are feeling there. So, so the type of scene matters a lot. In those scenes of adrenaline-producing external action, you will have a little bit less of the emotions stated in the thoughts, but because they're often implied. But then, oh, and here's sort of the rest of that scene. So, put that down, says Marianne quietly. I'm sorry, what? Says Jamie. Put that glass down, please, says Marianne. Jamie smiles and nods to himself. You want me to put it down? He says. Okay, look, I'm putting it down. He drops the glass on the floor and it shatters. Marianne screams, a real scream from her throat, and launches her body at Jamie, drawing her right arm behind her as if to strike him. Connell steps in between them. Glass crunches under his shoe, and he grabs Marianne by her upper arms. Behind him, Jamie is laughing. Marianne tries to push Connell aside. Her whole body shudders, and her face is blotchy and discolored like she's been crying. Come here, he says. Marianne. She looks at him. He remembers her in school, so bitter and stubborn with everyone. He knew things about her then. They look at each other, and the rigidity leaves her, and she goes slack like she's been shot. So this is a pretty external scene, and it's from Connell's point of view here. And just at the end is where we get this remembrance, but there's otherwise not a lot of his emotion stated in this. And I would say there really shouldn't be, because it's not appropriate to this scene. In scenes that are a little more pensive, you can state occasional emotions, a reflection, an aftermath, a realization. When he takes Marianne outside of the kitchen and they're alone, that would be the time to be introducing stated emotion. Deborah Gwartney is the last name, Mary. Yeah, I think Live Through This, I think, was one of her books. So when the in these more pensive scenes, when he takes her outside, that would be the time to have these statements of emotion. Or when the emotion is the core of the scene. So a couple examples, and I had longer excerpts in mind. I didn't want to overload you with excerpts, but I can kind of summarize for you. There's in this book, middle grade fantasy, transformed. This is again Megan Morrison, the same one who wrote the Cinderella adaptation. And this book, which I'm reading now with my daughter, is about the frog prince. This prince who's been turned into a frog, and he was really kind of a jerk when he was a human, and he's now remembering, as he's a frog, he's revisiting the place where he was banished, which led to his falling down a wishing well and being treated as a frog. And when he gets there, this is sort of a classic reflection or aftermath realization scene. He gets there, and triggered by seeing the place where he was banished from the family for being a jerk, he remembers all these things, and he dwells on people he has hurt. And it's not frequent that emotion is stated, but over the course of, I'm looking at a page and a half and probably 6 paragraphs, about 4 or 5 times, it's just stated outright. Suddenly uncomfortable, he began to descend the steps. He felt a pang of anxiety. Syra felt clammier than usual, trying to shake his bad feelings away. They don't need to be revolutionary or super imaginative statements of emotion. It's just that in their context, they're working quite well to orient us to his state of mind in the scene. The other scene I'm thinking of is the excerpt that I'm giving you from Normal People, which is a couple pages, and that's in the handout, and you can look at this one later. But it's a scene where Connell basically has this panic attack, And so the core of that scene is this, what's going on externally is two characters are talking, and it's fairly mundane. She has labeled herself kind of cold, and then he says, "You're not cold." And she says, "Oh, I didn't mean anything about it." And he says, "But you're not. Why would you think that?" And so it goes from there into him getting these feelings based purely on, kind of triggered by his own emotionality and his own interiority. And so in that case, the emotion is really the core of that scene. And so there, the emotion is stated a little bit more. Okay, pause quick, couple questions. First person present tense. Yeah, I actually don't think it's that different, that you're going to have a lot of external stuff. That first person narrator is maybe going to be a little bit more aware of their feelings and their body. I don't think it's going to be that different from a very close third person, I guess is what I'm saying. First person present is a close narration. So you're going to be in that realm of a lot of attention to thoughts and feeling. And as I go on, I'm going to try to give you some other tricks for being able to be efficient without mentioning how you feel all the time. And so that is without stating your emotions all the time. So keep that question in mind, Cash, and I will come back to it, but continue to nag me if I'm not kind of addressing that in some of the other things I'm explaining here. All right. This excerpt is also included in the other handout that I've given you. And this is from Name of the Wind. She comes to sit down with him and he touches her cheek. Oh, sorry, no, this is still from Normal People. This is that scene where he has the panic attack. And I may actually just fast forward past this in the case of, in the interest of moving on and not going too long with this. Because I want to explain this. Show versus tell. We're all familiar with that. Every writer has heard show, don't tell. I like to differentiate show, tell, and explain. And here's the difference. Showing is implying through externals. You show us Connell saying, "Can we go?" And we know he's impatient. Telling is stating emotion unnecessarily. Can we go? Connell said impatiently. You don't need to do that, right? And then explaining is stating emotion because it's complex or surprising and impossible to show. Sometimes, like, giving some sense of emotion just for emphasis is fine, pretty sparingly. But when there's a strong emotion, and that's maybe where we come back to this panic attack, he has a terrible sense all of a sudden that he could hit her face very hard even, and she would just sit there and let him. The idea frightens him so badly that he pulls his chair back and stands up. His hands are shaking. He doesn't know why he thought about it. Maybe he wants to do it, but it makes him feel sick. "What's wrong?" she says. He feels a kind of tingling in his fingers now, and he can't breathe right. And at first you think, this guy's horrible, but he's not. This is sort of the part where you start to really feel for him, because he's not the guy who wants to treat her like this. In fact, he's very much reacting against that. He just has a thought that people could do this to her. And it's pretty horrifying to him and to us. But notice too, it's complex because there's a chain, right? He has this thought, and the thought spurs this frightening moment, and it just builds on itself. So there, again, it comes back to emotion is the core of that scene. And so you're kind of daisy chaining those emotions together, and that's explaining emotion. Yes, I will post this, D. It should be, it'll be recorded, and then I also have this whole presentation notes on at a website I'll give you later. So emotion stating, be stealthy and sparing. Here's how you can be stealthy. So rather than say something was frustrating or was driving him over the edge, you can try memory, Really, all of these kind of come to thought. But memory, what does someone remember at that point? Speculation, what do they think may come of this in the future? And thought, is really kind of tied up with this memory and speculation. And if we go back to, you know, he doesn't know why he thought about it. The idea frightens him, etc. Here's a thought. He has this terrible sense all of a sudden that he could hit her face very hard and she would just sit there and let him. I guess that's speculation. So there's maybe some overlap here. Well, there's definitely overlap. But that's what we're looking at with emotions being stated. All right. So be stealthy with it. Try to sneak in that stuff. Be pretty sparing. Don't do it a lot. And you can be stealthy by sneaking in other ways of conveying emotion through external stuff and through what I'm about to tell you here. Thoughts. 2 ways to do thoughts in general, and then kind of 2 ways to do indirect thoughts. So there's indirect thoughts, and this is when you are narrating with mental action verbs. Thought, wondered, realized, wanted, needed, hoped, tried, those sorts of things. And you can do this in 2 ways. One looks like a dialogue tag, and this is from Normal People. Well, he thought, here I am on the floor. And the other looks like indirect speech. He thought of dropping Helen's hand, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Or he thought he would probably black out then, but he couldn't, but found he couldn't. Well, he thought here he was on the floor, I guess is the other way you would render this, if you wanted to turn this one into that one. But take a look here. This is from Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. This is the other excerpt I have in the longer handout with the 2 excerpts. A lot of indirect thinking here. It slowly began to dawn on me. There's a verb. This one's a phrasal. It began to dawn. That I had been staring at her wordlessly for an impossible amount of time, lost in my thoughts, lost in the sight of her. But her face didn't look offended or amused. It almost looked as if she were studying the lines of my face, almost as if she were waiting. I wanted to take her hand. I wanted to brush her cheek with my fingertips. I wanted to tell her that she was the first beautiful thing I had seen in 3 years, that the sight of her yawning to the back of her hand was enough to drive the breath from me, how I sometimes lost the sense of her words and the sweet fluting of her voice. I wanted to say that if she were with me, then somehow nothing could ever be wrong for me again. So all this wanting and longing and things dawning, realizations, they can be pretty powerful. Again, sort of depends on the type of scene. So that's kind of the last tip here. If it's in that one of those sort of reflective scenes, and there's a lot of tension and momentum coming into it, then that works very well. Again, kind of a show versus tell versus explain. I want to touch back on this because, like I said before, we can often intuit emotion, but it's very hard to do that with thoughts. So thoughts often warrant more explanation. When young Quoth is sitting there next to Denna in this excerpt here, those are the 2 characters involved. We couldn't guess necessarily all of this from the way they're interacting. The external isn't going to be sufficient. The external tinged with subjectivity isn't going to be sufficient for all of this, right? And he's not saying it. And that's actually the point. And you'll see in this excerpt, the longer excerpts has a little bit more. The point is that he's thinking all of this and he doesn't act on any of it, which is why the external is going to fail. And which is why I think the book is always better than the movie, because it can do things like that. And the movie just doesn't have access to that sort of stuff. All right, thoughts end up showing emotion. So we don't need to hear it all in this. You know, that he was in love with her. We certainly don't need all of the stuff about how his, you know, there were butterflies in his stomach and all the typical signs of love and that sort of thing. This is showing the emotion. Limit the thought to the character and avoid on-the-nose statements of desire. Okay, so what this means is if you, here are the things that this POV character is considering, right? And here's all the stuff he wants. There's a subtext here, which is, as the scene goes on, the reason he doesn't think he can do this, the reason he feels inadequate, that's all subtextual. So on the nose would be if he labeled his own psychology too accurately. But here he doesn't. We're limiting these thoughts, to his insights, his thinking, his view and attitude of the scene. And because of that, we're still leaving open all sorts of subtextual stuff about desire. That's maybe a little bit of a can of worms, the on the nose stuff. And I want to move on. Yeah, Marilyn. Yeah, some say not to use those verbs. Just, I know, you do hear that. And yet, when you look at your favorite stories, they often are using those verbs. So it's really interesting to sort of study what you've been told versus what you're seeing in the writing you've liked. Okay, last thing, and then I do want to wrap up in the next 10 minutes or so, not keep people too long. Direct thoughts means you skip the mental action verb entirely and you give us the direct thought. You imbue the narration with the character's voice, but keep to the same tense and person as the narration has been in up to that point. All right, take a look at this. In that breathless second, I almost asked her. I felt the question boiling up from my chest. I remember drawing a breath, then hesitating. What could I say? Come away with me? Stay with me? Come to the university? No. Sudden certainty tightened in my chest like a cold fist. What could I ask her? What could I offer? Nothing. Anything I said would sound foolish, a child's fantasy. Here's where it gets direct. Right in here, what could I say? Right? I remember drawing a breath, then hesitating. But I didn't know what to say, would be narrating with a little bit more remove. Here's the direct thought. Instead of I didn't know what to say, what could I say? So observe the difference between he wondered if he'd ever see her again and would he ever see her again? So that's what I mean by the direct thought, is you go straight into the character. Note this is not changing verb tense or person. So it's not, will I ever see her again? And for God's sake, don't put that in italics. You can do that. There are books that do that and they get away with it. It's just a huge pet peeve of mine. And if I ever edit your stuff, I will call you out on it. And I will argue that you shouldn't. So I think you still want to be narration. I think this is the narrator. You're always going to be the narrator. You're not the character. And as the narrator, you should stick with that narration. Okay, so here's the list, the taxonomy: external narration, external tinge with subjectivity, emotion stated, indirect thoughts, direct thoughts. Here's what I'd like to try. There's this presentation in the handouts, and then there is a 3-page excerpt that has an excerpt from Normal People and one from Name of the Wind. The scenes in that handout, and you can go there to download them if you haven't already. I've highlighted several sentences within those handouts, and your challenge would be to label those sentences. Some of them are just phrases, but most of them are sentences. Label them with what level of narration, see my taxonomy that I just went over, and just label them with, like, you can number them 1 through 5, or you can just say external, external with subjectivity, emotion, indirect thought, direct thought. So just go through and label them, and this is just sort of a practice for you to start seeing them. And then write or revise a scene of 1 to 3 pages and see if you can hit all 5 levels. Don't worry about labeling them, okay? You're just going to practice with this and see, you know, what it looks like for you to have external. Should you go fully external here? Should you tinge it with subjectivity? Is this an appropriate place to have some indirect thoughts? Can you go in close? So there's obviously a lot of nuance with a lot of this stuff, and this could easily be a 4-hour class that we're doing, but I just want to sort of get it out there for you to practice and then we can struggle with that a little bit, and then touch base on Thursday to go over some Q&A. Yeah, so that's the assignment. I went over this first part here where I highlighted these sentences. I went through it myself, and I just sort of labeled from 1 to 5. And then I had a total geek out nerdy moment, and I thought, let's graph this. And normally I would say don't do this, but it was pretty interesting because this is what the normal normal people excerpt looked like. And it's a very sketchy, blurry graph for me, but it went up and down like this, and I thought, well, that's actually kind of fascinating. So again, normally I would say, yeah, let's not turn everything into numbers. But I do think there's some insights here. I'm not a fan of turning right into graphs, but that up and down graph movement over the course of the scene, I think was really fascinating. I think it lends that dynamism and actually may exactly be what we're talking about when we're talking about the train versus the third rail, because we're going back and forth between the external stuff and then how the character is perceiving it, and then back and forth between it, and gives that dynamism. So thanks, Trisha. It's okay to turn everything into numbers. All right, 2 more things after this little plug. If you got something from the class, I'd appreciate a donation, Venmo, PayPal. Here are the links. If you have questions for me, you want to email me, that would be lovely. I'm definitely up for addressing some of these questions. And there's some other craziness going on in the house, so my usual response time is probably a little slower. And if you want to wait until Thursday and join the Zoom class and then donate something, that would be fine too. Normally, if I do a class like this in person and we're talking to people, a 2-hour class, about $50, just to give you sort of ballpark of what I've done these classes for. But if you can chip in anything, if you can't, that's fine. I understand people are in hard times right now. 5, 10, a little more it would be great, and I'd appreciate it. 2 last things. I want to offer this to get some eyes on your homework. If you'd like me to have you pair you up with someone, email me as soon as this is over and let me know your name, your preferred email, and your genre of writing. And then try to have your pages ready within the next 24 hours. So your deadline is, approximately 3 o'clock Central Time tomorrow. And I'll try to pair you up with someone else in a similar genre. And you can exchange work and see what questions arise from this exercise. In many ways, this is sort of about let's raise questions from this. Let's find the places where we're really getting stuck and find the challenges, and then have a better venue than this to have some dialogue about it. And then we'll have a follow-up Q&A on Thursday. It's at 1:30, 2 days from now. If you're a subscriber to my newsletter, the link to that is in emails I've sent out. The link is also at this page where you can get all the resources. And then that page has the 2 downloads, the extended excerpt and this presentation. And yeah, and back to this, and I'll leave on that screen. Just tweak some things over here. So that's that. If you can, yeah, go to that site, stormwritingschool.com, PE live stream, and that'll have stuff. And thank you guys so much for showing up. And hopefully this experiment went well, and I can try it again in coming weeks. So I'll leave things going a little bit, just so you can chime in some comments, and I'll try to hang out just for about, I don't know, 5-10 more minutes and address maybe some of these in the comments, and then get going and hopefully talk to many of you on Thursday. All right. I'm going to mute now, but I'll be looking at the comments, and then I'll end the broadcast in a couple minutes.